So Katia, go ahead, please.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to this week's NOVAFRICA seminar, webinar. It's a pleasure to welcome everyone to this talk on or asking the question, does exposure to other ethnic regions promote national integration? This is evidence from Nigeria, and it's our pleasure to welcome Oyebola Okunogbe from the World Bank to tell us about this. So in terms of ground rules, I mean, feel free, unless Oyebola prefers just to take questions at the end. I mean, feel free to voice your questions. For participants, you can type in the Q&A and we will allow you to ask your questions as well. Okay, so thank you very much, Oyebola. The floor is yours.
Great, thanks very much. Can you all hear me?
Yes.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and thank you for everyone for being here. I thank Wayne and Raquel and Katia and everybody else for the warm invitation. It's my pleasure to present to you this project that looks at the impact of exposure to other ethnic regions on national integration using Nigeria as our place of study. And to start with, the background is that there's a literature that links high levels of ethnic and religious diversity to a host of negative social, political, and economic outcomes. And so for countries that are multi-ethnic, there's the challenge of how do you foster a strong sense of national identity and intergroup cohesion when people have these primordial loyalties that they hold dear. And there are different approaches that countries have taken to address this. So for instance, they might change the name of their country from something that was given by the colonialists to something that they think is more indigenous and more representative. Countries have moved the capital city from the coast or the periphery to a more central location as a way of building cohesiveness, changing the currency, stamps, national anthem, flags, pledge of allegiance, all are different ways that countries have attempted to try to create in their citizens this sense of oneness. Also changing the language or the education curriculum or the language in which students are taught in schools. Now, today I'm going to be focusing on one of these approaches that countries have taken, which is the use of national service programs. And these programs typically involve relocating citizens temporarily, and these are usually young people, and moving them from one part of the country to a different part for national service. And the goals of these programs are typically to foster loyalty to the nation, to build a sense of civic responsibility, and to expose them to the diversity of the country, essentially get them out of their little bubbles to see what the whole country looks like, engage in service to these different people, and through that, build in them the sense of national identity. And there's several of these programs. Ghana has a very active one, Kenya, Malaysia, and of course, Nigeria, which is what we're studying today. In Nigeria, it is called the National Youth Service Corps. It's been around for over 40 years, and it's a mandatory program for all college graduates. I'm going to describe the program in more detail later on, but for now, the key feature I wanted to highlight is that it randomly assigns participants to different parts of the country for their national service. This randomized allocation leads to two features that I will focus on. The first one is that in each state, there is a diverse cohort of participants. So this means that every participant is exposed to a diverse peer group because they're mixing with participants from all other different universities in different parts of the country, and they're all together doing this national service. Now, the second thing that happens as a result of the randomized allocations is that the participants are then assigned to states that have different ethnic compositions. And I'm going to be focusing on two groups for this presentation. One are those participants that are assigned to a state where they are the majority ethnicity. So I'll think of these people as my control group because they remain within their ethnic homeland. And the second group are those that are exposed to states where they are not the majority. And I'll be thinking of this as the treatment group. And so the question that we're going to be looking at specifically is, what is the impact of temporary relocation to other ethnic regions on individuals, attitudes, and actions that are important for national integration. And we're looking at this relative to being exposed to a diverse group of peers. And this is an important distinction to make. So everybody has a diverse group of peers. I'm looking at the difference in whether you are then sent to live among a different ethnic group. And there are many characteristics of states in Nigeria that I could potentially look at. And so we're focusing on inter-ethnic exposure because ethnicity is a very salient dimension of identity in Nigeria. There are over 300 ethnic groups. The three big ones are Hausa, Igbo, and Yoruba. And the specific thing about ethnicity in Nigeria is also that there's a history of civil conflict. So there's a big Biafran war in around 1970 that was fought along ethnic lines. And so this is a big, it's very salient up till today. And so in this paper, I'm going to be looking at, because I work with one university that's from a Yoruba state, and so I'm going to be looking at participants from that one of the big three groups as they go to other parts of the country. And so the Yoruba students are an important and interesting group to look out for a few reasons. So one, like I mentioned, they're one of the three largest groups. Second is that they're unique in that they have a similar share of Christians and Muslims that live in relatively peaceful coexistence. And this is in contrast to, for instance, the Hausa that are predominantly Muslim and the Igbo that is predominantly Christian. As such, when these Yorubas are going to a different part of the country, religion is not that's not the new dimension that they're exposed to. It's really the ethnic dimension. Again, Yoruba did not have a history of secession, and so we might think that, for instance, the Igbo ethnic group that did, their results might be different compared to other ethnicities, given that this is such a big part of the history. And lastly, there are very low levels of inter-ethnic migration among Yorubas. Only about 5% of Yorubas are living outside their homeland at the time of this survey. And so moving outside the ethnic homeland is like a very significant transition that's interesting to study. And just to show some of this in graphs, this is a graph of non-Yorubas in different, these are the 37 states of the country, so 36 plus the capital. And what we find is that Yorubas, like I was mentioning, are predominantly concentrated in their homeland. There are very few of them outside of their homeland. This second graph is showing the different states of Nigeria and showing which ethnic group is the majority, meaning has over 50% of citizens from that group. So starting again from the southwest, that's the Yoruba with over 50%. Up here is the Hausa, and then surrounding it in this darker shade of green are what I'm calling northern minorities, in the sense that there's no one ethnic group that is more than 50%. Over here is Igbo states where there's the Igbo majority, and surrounding it also what I'm calling southern minorities, where there isn't one predominant ethnic group.
All right, so hello, good afternoon, Oyebola. This is Arinza speaking here. So I just have a quick clarification regarding your random assignment. So I do know that in the NYSC in Nigeria, there are some participants actually influence the assignments.
Yes, don't worry, we're going to get to them, our influences.
Okay.
We will talk about
the idea
this.
is how do you control for this, right?
Yes,
so how do you
don't
know
worry. We're going to get there. That's key. Yes.
I have another question.
Yes.
Can you just clarify how does division in ethnic groups match with division in religion?
Oh, sure. Yes, that's a good. So up here at the Hausa, these are predominantly Muslim. And here at Igbo, these are predominantly Christian. For religion, I would say also in the southern minorities, it's predominantly Christian. But then in these northern minorities, I think it really differs. There's certain states where there's about half Christian Muslim. There's some that are predominant, like up here in the north, very Muslim. But then in this middle belt area, there's a mix. But Yorubas are about half Christian, half Muslim. But these other two predominant ones, Hausa is predominantly Muslim, Igbo is predominantly Christian.
Sorry, if I can just follow up on that.
Yes.
When you say that it's 50% among the Yoruba, is it clustered geographically, or it's like any village will be with some share of it?
So I would say that, I mean, I don't think you'll find like a whole village that's Muslim. I think there's a good mix. There's, you know, a lot of Christian and Muslim influence there. Let me take that back. You could find some specific villages that maybe it's like a lot of Christians, a lot of Muslims, but I would say overall, that's not the norm. It's somewhere like Lagos, for instance, you might find more Christian relative to a different states, maybe like Osho states, just using my, this again, I would have to look at the numbers for this, but I would just say that it's overall, I think most people agree that it's very mixed. And many families, you have both Christians and Muslims in the same family, and that's very common. Yeah. Okay, so now we're going to talk about, in this setting, individuals from a majority group and how this setting differs from the typical, because there are many papers in this literature on exposure within groups and contact hypothesis. And I'll say that by and large, in our main setting, typical setting, we have individuals from a majority group that are exposed to peers from a minority group. And usually it's in an institutional setting, such as roommates and classmates. So there's long lists of papers in this, but this paper is different in the sense that here we're looking at individuals moving. So we're not just looking at people staying in the same school or class and we're just mixing their composition. We're actually moving people. And so there's a physical relocation that's involved in this treatment. And secondly, there is a degree of interethnic exposure that's very different here. So in your typical setting, people remain in their states as a majority, and then they're exposed to a different group. Here, we're moving people to go and live as a minority somewhere else. That's what this treatment is. And so that's a very unique part of it. And we're looking at outcomes in the medium term, so 7 years later, whereas typically we're looking at outcomes 1 or 2 years after the intervention, while people are still like in their school. And there are a number of papers that are related in these ways. So for instance, there's the Bazi et al. That looks at Indonesia, voluntary resettlement of citizens in outlying islands and looking at the impact of that on sense of national identity. And there are also 2 new papers looking at military service in Spain. That's a very similar design where they send, they recruit to different parts of the country to complete their military service and looking at the impact of national identity. So I'm going to give a very quick overview of the results, and before obviously going into the details. So the main findings first is that in terms of migration, that's one of the main aspects of integration we're looking at. People that are exposed are 4 times more likely to live outside their ethnic region 7 years later. And it's not the case where they just remain where they were posted. Instead, we find that they're now more mobile across the country. In line with that, we also find that they're more knowledgeable about different regions of the country. We have a very simple test about knowing the capitals of states and knowing the governors of states. And we find that these people that have lived for a year outside their home region are more knowledgeable in that regard. In addition, these individuals have greater national pride. It's a good question on how proud are you to be Nigerian, and they have higher responses. And the way that I interpret these results is to think of it as physical relocation. It seems to be expanding people's mental and physical boundaries. They start to think of themselves as belonging to this entity that's greater than their own individual self. And such, they're able to think of themselves as Nigerian and think of that ethnic and their national pride and the ability to live all over the country, think of the country as their own, is increasing. In addition, we find that these individuals have greater ethnic pride and feel closer to their own ethnic group. And describe this as how I never really felt so Nigerian as until I moved to the US. That's when that becomes my primary label and a primary means of identification, because I'm now in a very different environment. And so I think it's the same thing that we're seeing with these individuals, that being immersed in a different ethnic group, it's reinforcing their own ethnic identity. The second finding is along those lines is that we don't find any significant change in their attitudes towards other ethnic groups. So this, I think, is very initially quite puzzling, because the whole idea of contact hypothesis is that when you meet other people, then you remove, your biases are reduced and your attitudes towards them improve. And what I think is that this might be because we're comparing these exposed participants to others who have also been exposed to a diverse peer group. And so we don't find any further updating of their attitudes towards these other ethnic groups. And I'm going to show some results later on that suggests that even if there's no further updating on attitudes, there are actually increased relationships. So we find some evidence about people being more likely to date or to marry people from the groups to which they were exposed. So I might not necessarily have a jump in how much I like these people or trust them, but because I'm exposed to more of them, I may actually have be more likely to date one of them. Okay. So I'm going to dive in now to talk about the Youth Service Corps in Nigeria. It was started in 1973 to reconstruct, reconcile, and rebuild the country after the devastating civil war. And one of the stated goals is very much tied to this idea of national identity. It says it's to encourage the development of common ties among the youths of Nigeria and the promotion of national unity. It is a one-year program that is mandatory for all university graduates that complete their education when they're younger than 30 years old. So if you're 30 years old, on the day you graduate, you're exempted from the program. Otherwise, you must do it. And this is enforced because employers are not legally allowed to hire someone unless they produce their certificates of graduation from this service program. It's a very large program. It has about 200,000 participants annually, and it's costs about $500 million a year. And so for comparison, in a country of about over 100 million people, this is 25% of the health budget of the entire country that is spent on these 200,000 participants each year. So the country is investing a lot in this. The service program has 4 components. There's a 3-week orientation camp where you go to the state you've been posted to. You learn about the states, the language. There are lots of activities to build camaraderie with the fellow corps members. You're all wearing the same uniform, doing all these activities, games, sports. It's very like a 3-week boot camp with lots of fun activities designed to build your sense of companionship and to introduce you to the states that you've been posted to. After that, you're assigned to what they call your primary assignment. It's the job that you hold for the entire year. About 60 to 70% of this, it's teaching. And you're paid a stipend. At the time of the study, it was about $100 that the government paid each corps member, and oftentimes the employer supplements it. Community service is another part of it. One day of the week, instead of going to your primary assignment, your job, you go together with your cohort members to do this community service project. So it could be doing something like making a bridge somewhere, or cleaning up markets, or teaching IT to kids in school, or the different service groups that people could join. And at the end of all of this, you get a completion certificates where, like I mentioned earlier, you must present it to be able to be legally employed.
May I ask a quick question?
Yes.
Is the primary assignment competitive? So is there a ranking? Are there interviews, or is just a random assignment?
So it's not, I think each state does it quite differently. My understanding is that the employers write to their states and request, oh, I am a school, we need a social studies teacher. I am a bank, I need somebody. I am a newspaper, I need someone. So both public and private people can write. And then someone in the NYSC tries to assign people to these jobs based on the requests that have come in and what the student has studied. It's not always perfect, but that's the general idea, is that whatever you've studied, in some cases it's very clear, like if you're a doctor, then yes, you're assigned to a hospital. But other cases, like if you studied economics, maybe you could teach economics, you could work in a bank, you could work, there are many other things. Yeah.
And does the distribution of salaries reflect more or less the salaries in the real job market, or is the same for everybody?
No, so for the one paid by the government is the same for everyone, regardless of what you're doing. But then your employer has complete discretion in what they want to give you as an extra.
Okay.
So you could have a school that maybe is just giving you free accommodation and not much else, or you could have a bank that maybe is giving you like what they will pay their entry level workers. So it really depends. There's a lot of variation in that.
Okay,
we're not going to do a lot with the primary assignment here, again, because I'm working across so many different states, and each state might have slightly different ways of doing it. And so I'm going to be looking more at things at just the overall exposure to a state. Yeah.
Thank you. Right.
Okay,
Oyebola,
so,
I have one question, Oyebola.
yes,
So I was
yes.
wondering, how do you follow up with the participants, like to know that they actually participated actively within the assigned states?
Okay.
And the second.
Don't worry, we'll get there.
Okay. So, and secondly, the thing is, I was wondering which period is your study, and if you fell in within the time that Boko Haram had already started, how did the terrorism actually affect the assignment, right? Because certainly for people that are posted to the Northeast, they would say, I don't want to go because we're afraid. So how did that affect your sample and also your random assignment, as you mentioned?
Yes. So this happened, the people that I'm looking at, I'm going to...
no, if it's going to take you further down, I can wait. Okay, I can wait.
A quick answer to the question about Boko Haram is that these are happening before the big crisis, and because at one point they explicitly stopped posting people to certain parts of the country because of Boko Haram. They resumed later on, but this is all before that they all served before that.
Before that, all right.
And I'm going to describe in detail like the sample that I used, the year, and all of that, and then the other questions, then things that are not clear to.
Okay. Then,
so this is from
hello.
Yes.
Can I ask about the employment side? So I think you mentioned that a person could not accept a formal job without completing this program before the age of 30. I'm wondering about the levels of informality, even for graduates. Could it be that actually most jobs are informal, and to that extent, this is not a very, very binding constraint?
Yes, I mean, I would say that even if many jobs are informal, they aspire to formal jobs, right? And so you don't want to lose your chance. I think there's certain people that do not do it, for instance, if they feel like, oh, I'm leaving the country and I never intend to come back. And so they just choose, I'm going to go and do a one-year master's during that year instead of doing this service program. Or, people who maybe they know that, oh, I have this, so I would say it's not so much on the lower end of the informality that people might ignore the program. It's more people who think they might not need to work for an employer in Nigeria. That's what you get. Okay, so
Oyebola, one clarification. I mean, for the program, is it restricted to only public service, or I mean, it's not only by teaching? Because I mean, my thought was you just need to teach, but it can be anywhere. You can be assigned anywhere.
Yes.
Be it private or public.
It could be private, it could be a bank, it could be a public school, it could be a non-profit. Anybody can request a copper. So the procedure by which coppers are assigned, this is from interviews with officials of the NYSC, is that first each university has to send the NYSC its list of graduating students. So their name, date of birth, marital status, different, what course they studied, different personal information like that. And then at the youth service, they use a computer algorithm to randomly assign students to one of the 37 states of the country with these different considerations. So one is that married women and those with chronic illnesses, they can request to be posted close to their family because they think that they need to be close to their families. The second rule is that no student should be posted to his or her home state. Third, they say they design the assignments to address the different manpower needs in different parts of the country. And fourth is that their goal is that the cohorts for each state should reflect the diversity of the overall graduating cohorts that year. And before I go into questions about how this randomization works in practice and what's the deviations that we observe from it, I'm going to first just describe again the conceptual framework that I have in mind so that when we get to the analysis, it'll be very clear what's going on. So again, there are two layers of exposure that our participants are experiencing, and each of these layers may have different impacts. So these are, think of 4 participants. Now, all of them are exposed to these diverse cohorts as a result of the assignment of people from all over the country to whatever state they're posted to. And then amidst this exposure to a diverse cohort, they are then exposed to different ethnic communities. So our control groups are those that are then posted to the community that's the same. They're also blue people that they're posted to, and then others are posted to very different, to different ethnicities. I will think of those as the treated. And I can mention there are 4 groups of treatments that I'll be considering being posted to a Hausa state, an Igbo state, a northern minority, and a southern minority. Okay, and so of these, they are.
One short question, sorry,
Yes.
if I may, on this previous slide. Like, if there's these 3 very dominant group, I would expect that in the diversity in the cohort, sometimes you have, say, many yellow individual, and these many yellow individual, they will react differently if they're posted in a yellow place than in a non-yellow place. And how does that affect the blue individual? Is this a heterogeneity you can live? Is there some cohorts that have fewer or a bigger share of yellow individuals, say?
Yeah, so I mean, that would just say that is the impact different in being posted to like an Igbo state, given that, for instance, that's because there are high levels of tertiary education too among Igbos. And so in any mix, you would see a lot of that. I'm actually going to show you what these interactions look like in a couple of slides, yeah. So thinking about, okay, so what potential impacts could these different dimensions of exposure have? The first one is the very well-known intergroup contact theory that states that by being exposed to people from a different group, it removes prejudice and it increases understanding. And we can think of this as intergroup contact theories probably at work amongst the diverse cohorts, but then we now have the intensive margin of it by you being posted to a state with a different ethnic majority, where you're now exposed to a lot of the people from that state. And what I'm going to show is that even in our control group, there are high levels of interactions with other ethnic groups, but then it becomes even higher when you're posted to that state. So really, we're dealing with this intensive margin here. The second possible impact of being exposed to a different ethnic region is having a stronger national identity. As you move out of your own group, you see that the country is beyond your ethnicity, beyond your state, and you see the diversity of the country, and that could lead to a greater sense of national identity about this entity to which you belong.
Hello, Oyebola, can I just ask a question?
Sure.
Okay. I can see you are showing your randomization, but I'm concerned about one issue. How did you take care of the religious issue? Because, you know, when you move a Southwestern Muslim to a Muslim state in the north, or a Southwestern Christian to Southeast, where we have a Christian as the dominant group, you know, they may feel more at home, and that will influence the experience that they will report. So how did you take care of that religious?
Yes. I do look at, so when I look at heterogeneity in different dimensions. So one is when you're exposed, exactly what you said, to a place where it's a different ethnicity, but the same religion, do you find different effects from when you're exposed to a different ethnicity, but a different religion from the one that you hold? And I was expecting exactly what you were saying about this kind of greater familiarity. I don't find that in my results. But again, I'll get to that once you've seen kind of the overall results, then we can talk about how it might differ across different subgroups. But that is one dimension that I was interested in, but I don't see evidence for that. Thinking again back about this potential ways in which exposure to a different ethnic region might affect your attitudes regarding national integration. So we discussed, okay, one, it could be an intensive margin of intergroup contact theory, where there's just a deeper level of exposure. Two, it could lead to a stronger national identity by exposing you to the overall diversity of the country, the sense of belonging to something greater than your own individual group. And third is this idea that it could reinforce your own ethnic identity. So there's this literature about thinking about immigrants in different countries that actually invest more in their children to pass on their specific ethnic traits because they're now a minority in a different group. And that's a potential other dimension, is that because you're now a minority in a different group, you could lead to reinforcement of your own ethnic identity. So these are kind of three different potential outcomes that we'll be looking at. So,
can I ask a question?
Yes.
So I was wondering about the extent to which these people interact with other people in the program, and not so much with people. I mean, if they are teaching, for instance, they'll interact with students, but maybe their main, group of peers is the peers in the program. That's a question I'm imagining. So if that is the case, it would be interesting to check heterogeneity across occupations, across settings in which people would actually have to interact a lot with at the same level in terms of social interaction with the people in the state, in the state where they are living.
Okay. So this goes, I think, a bit to a question Arinza was asking also earlier, or somebody else, about the level of interaction with other groups. And what I do have is I ask about who did you interact with more on a daily basis. And I can see, who says, well, I did almost all my interactions with this group or very few with this other group. And I have not looked at the heterogeneity by that. Or at least that's not in the paper. I remember looking at it a while ago, and it's not, there's no distinct messages that are coming out of that. I'm not seeing that, if you are in a group where you do not interact as much, then you are not having the same results as others. But again, I always say all of this. I'm going to show you what the data is now, what the sample is. It's limited in what I'm able to do or not do. And so I think of this really as a first cut, as just showing the overall. I think what I'm really going to have a lot of confidence to talk about are these aggregate results. And to the extent there's some places where there's some heterogeneity that I can explore, and I do. But overall, there's the overall message that I feel the most confidence in at these aggregate outcomes. So the data that I'm using, first are the administrative data on NYC postings and the student characteristics from this university that I'm partnering with. Two, focus groups and qualitative interviews with over 80 participants from different universities, just learning about what the expectations were, what the assignment process were, the randomization, their experiences that informed a lot of the questions that I asked in the survey. Third are state level variables from the Nigeria analysis, which is what I use in place of the census, because we don't have micro census data available to be able to describe the different states. So we have to rely on these surveys that are representative at the state level. And these are for variables like what's the rate of the ethnic majority in different states, the poverty, what's share of the state is rural, religion, things like that. And also there's an alumni survey, which is the core data that I'm using with the cohort that graduated in 2008. So this was going to the earlier question about when this study happened. So these people graduated in 2008, and I interviewed them 7 years later. And they're from a public university in a Yoruba majority state. In this survey, I'm restricting it to Yoruba, the analysis of Yoruba students, because they're over 75%, and they're not enough from any of the other major groups to be able to do a similar analysis on them, because like I mentioned, there's very many groups in Nigeria. And the survey also excludes married women because these people are explicitly non-random. When we do this survey, we introduce it as an alumni survey from the university, because we're partnering with the university, and not as an NYSC survey to avoid creating experimental demand bias, priming people to think about youth service. And any question related to the NYSC is in the last section of the paper, is in the last section of the questionnaire. So there's a cohort of about 1,200 students. We were able to interview about half of them. And we had to literally find these people, because we started finding with the alumni list, but it was very incomplete. Lots of phone numbers missing, people all over the country, all over the world, actually. And so trying to track down these people, going through their classmates, and at the end, we're able to find about half of them. So now, thinking about identification. So the challenge is that migration, as we all know, is typically endogenous. If we just wanted to compare who moved to non-Yoruba states to who did, there are many other characteristics that might be at play. And so we're relying on these postings by the youth service. And these postings, at the same time, it's not just ethnicity that's assigning, it's assigning people to a bucket of characteristics in the states to which they're posted. And so some of the key ones we think about distance. Is it just you're going somewhere further away? Is it the poverty level of the states? Is it how rural it is, the religion? And what I would show is that the impact of ethnicity persists after controlling for these. So these are some of these characteristics I was describing. Being Yoruba would be definitely correlated with distance. It's also correlated with being rural. Yoruba states are the least rural. In terms of the Muslim share, as I was describing earlier, there's a mix within Yoruba states, where these other parts of the country is more Muslim versus more Christian. And then the poverty rate also differs across the states. So these will be variables that will be taken into consideration with the analysis. Okay, so this was one of the early questions about how people might deviate from the randomization protocol. So there are two ways in which this could happen. The first one is that certain participants can redeploy to a different state after they've been initially posted. So in the admin data, I can see where you're posted to, but then it could be indeed that you end up serving somewhere else, because after you've been posted, you go back to the NYSC and say, oh, actually I have this chronic illness, or I have this problem, and I really need to be posted to this other state, or some other reason that you're able to influence that. And so I asked people about this in the survey, and 13 participants say that they redeployed, meaning they served in a different states from where they were assigned. And I can observe this also in the admin data, because I asked them, where were you posted and where did you serve? And so I can compare with the admin data that I have about where they were posted. And doing this comparison, I find that 90% of them are consistent with what I see in the admin data. So it seems like they're reporting this quite honestly. And so what I use for this group is that I use the state to which they are assigned as an instrument for the state in which they serve. The second group are more tricky, because these are the people where we have no admin data where they would have been initially posted, because even before the initial posting, they somehow were able to influence where they were posted to. So I also asked them about this, did you influence your posting? And 10% are saying that yes, they were able to influence their posting. And in fact, this group, it's a very clear pattern in that they're all posted to the Southwest. So somehow they should have been posted somewhere else, but found themselves able to be posted to a Yoruba state. And so what I do is that I exclude these people from the analysis that I'm doing. And I also have reports, tables in the appendix of the paper that show the results, including them and excluding them. But these people are endogenously posted, and so they are not random, and so they are not included in the main analysis that I'm going to use. Arinze,
you did address some of my concerns. So I just have one last, not last, at least one thing that I just realized now. So Just before the Boko Haram started, there was also this conflict that was taking place in the South, right? So in the middle belt, in the South area, right, of the Delta. So my question is, for people that were posted there, was there actually any difference compared to those that were not posted, that were posted to places that did not have any conflict outcomes?
I'm going to show you outcomes. Oh, sorry. Finish.
Also bearing in mind that in 2009, there was this bit of a peace agreement between the government and also the rebel groups in this area. So how did that really affect the results in any way?
Okay, so I'm going to be showing results for overall being posted Yoruba versus non-Yoruba, and then also for each of these 4 groups. So when you posted to Hausa states, Igbo states, North minority state, or South minority state. So that South minority will be the South. So when we get there, we can look at those results and see if they seem to be different from the other places.
Okay, that's fine.
So the next thing that I do is that I look at the administrative data and I see to what extent are these rules followed of how people should be posted. I find that almost all cases, if they follow the rule of not posting people to their home states. And then I also look at the characteristics of individuals and see that they are not systematically correlated with being posted to a Yoruba state or not. So this is one example of the table. So the outcome here is being posted to a non-Yoruba majority state. And then I look at correlations with age, female, if you change your course, if you're married. These are the admin data that I have. And then the data that I collect in the survey about religion, if you previously lived in the non-Yoruba states, what kind of secondary school you went to, parents' higher education, as ways of looking at socioeconomic class, because that's probably correlated with people who are trying to influence. And so what I find is that the joint correlation of those variables does not suggest that they're systematically correlated with being assigned to treatment. This is the overall empirical specification. The main thing to note is that because of the issue I mentioned earlier, I am instrumenting for your exposure status by your state of assignment, given that some people did not serve in the state to which they were assigned to. And then I have the baseline characteristics that I showed just in the previous slide. And I have fixed effects for your state of origin, and then the interviewer on the survey, and then I cluster standard errors by your state of posting. And so the main outcomes we're looking at are migration, attitudes to the nation, and then attitude to your own group and other groups. Okay, so now let's dive into what we find. So the first thing to note is that serving in a different ethnic region, it's led to more interactions with other ethnic groups. There was some questions along this line, that who did they actually interact with? And so the way I try to look at this is to ask them to please think about the people you mostly interacted with during NYSC at home and at work. Get into this concern of, is it the people that you're working with, like the students, or the people that maybe you hang out with? So just overall, about what share of them were each of these different ethnic groups. So Hausa, Igbo, Yoruba, and then other minority groups. I found that these other northern groups or other southern groups were very hard because these different other groups are quite small often. You never find anybody saying they interacted with more than half of them. So the different options that we have are none, just a few, less than half, but more than a few, more than half, but not almost all, and almost all. And these options are given because the idea was that if you ask them to give percentages, it might be difficult. So what I do in the analysis is that I'm trying to see, okay, who had any significant level of interaction with this particular group. So if you say you had less than half, but more than a few, or you had more than half, or you had almost all, I classify you as having a significant amount of interaction with the group. And so what we find is this. So on the x-axis, these are the different states of posting. So if we take the first 3 bars, these are people that are posted to Yoruba states. About 25% of them are saying that they had a significant amount of interaction with Hausas on a daily basis. It's higher for Igbos, and then obviously very high for Yorubas than in Yoruba states. If you move to Hausa states, I would expect there's the highest level, the saying that they had interactions with Hausas, but then also a significant amount of Igbos, and then significant amount of Yorubas. And so the main takeaway from this is really that we do find two things. One is that even when you are in a control state like a Yoruba state, you're still having significant amounts of interactions with other groups. And so it's really, like I was saying earlier, it's an intensive margin treatment where now, so with Hausa, it's higher if you're in a Hausa or Northern minority states, because that's where you have a lot of Hausas. And then with Igbos, that's a red bars, it's higher if you're in an Igbo state or Southern minority states. And overall, if the amount of interactions you're having with Yorubas is decreasing when you're no longer in the Yoruba region. Second thing about the experience there was that overall they had positive experiences with their host communities. So I asked about the quality of your stay. Did you visit people at home? Did they invite you to attend their celebrations? Did they give you a gift when you were leaving? Are you still in touch with them? Overall, did you feel welcome? And so over there too, we find that there's quite high levels, even in people that were exposed outside their own ethnic region. And looking across the different groups, this was one of the earlier questions I think Arinze was asking. We find that in most of in three, in Northern minority, Igbo, and Southern minority, people report having even higher quality compared to those that were that remained in the Yoruba region. And so all of that except for the Hausa region is where we don't find the same amount of this increase in people saying that they had a great time or they had a good time in their service year. Okay.
Sorry. Going back to your question, to the last line.
Yep.
The one that you showed about the Hausa not having. So I was just wondering here, so why would that be the case, given that the Yorubas also are Muslims, right? So some of them are Muslims and they also go to a Muslim-dominated state, right? Like the Hausa. So why is it that we cannot find any result here?
The one thing that's actually, I don't know if I have that table later on, because I do, like I was saying earlier, I do all of these results by seeing if you went to the same group. And there, I think it might be the case that there is an impact on the interaction of Muslim and Hausa. I would have to check that. But overall, I think that's one reason but I feel like it's the same, right? So it must be that it's something other than religion in general. So in the sample, there are, actually, no, that's a good point. In this sample of university graduates of the students from this particular university, I would say that there are slightly more Christians. Maybe that is, that interaction then is greater. So if on average, there's more Christian compared to Muslim in the sample that I'm looking at, maybe you wouldn't have that interaction effect that you're describing, but it's something that I have to check. What share of my sample is Christian? And I also, this result, the reason why I'm not emphasizing so much this interaction between religion and ethnicity is that for most of the other outcomes that I'm actually looking at of what happens to you 7 years later, I don't see systematic differences. And so it is, that's when we think about what happened to you after you were treated, I don't find that to be systematically different.
Yeah, all right, okay, because the reason also why I kind of raised the point is that if you look at the Northern minority, the result, the gap is huge, right? And it's highly significant. So if you're getting it in another minority that is also within the northern part of the country, where you also have Muslim-dominated groups, so why are you not getting it actually in the states where it's already Muslim dominated?
Yeah, although I would remind you that the northern minority has both Muslim dominated groups and Christian dominated groups. So that's it's a combination of all of that. And I don't know, I mean, religion is just one potential explanation, right? There should be many different things about being exposed to Hausa. It's not just about the religion. So that could be at play. So so that was about what was the experience like, who did they interact with, and what was the quality of stay. Now we're going to think about, okay, so what actually happened to them 7 years later. So the first outcome is on migration. And this is what found very striking is that people who were moved once, voluntarily now, 7 years later, they're 4 times likely to be living in a different ethnic region. And that this effect is not just driven by being in your NYSC states. So this is just it. Overall, about 5% of people are living in a non-Yoruba region, but among those that are treated, the exposed, it's about 15%. And then this regression is looking at the first row is the outcome there is, are you living in a non-Yoruba region? The second one is, are you living in a non-Yoruba region that is also not your NYSC state? And then the third one is a non-Yoruba region that is not your NYSC region overall. If you think about things about maybe just the overall language or culture might have induced you to stay. And the first row, so the first set of coefficients are just looking overall exposed, not exposed. And then the second one is where I'm controlling for these other state characteristics that I was describing earlier, like the distance, being rural, all of that. And so living in a non-Yoruba region there's a positive impact on that, and then it remains even when you're living in a non-NYSC state and also in the non-NYSC region. So the interpretation I give that is that they're just more willing and more mobile to move across the country. The second is about knowledge.
To go a bit further on this result, I find it super intriguing and interesting. Do you have the power to further split by whether the state where they live, which is not the one where they had been allocated, is within the ethnic homeland of the group to which they were exposed during their service?
So please, could you say that again?
So going back to this last table, if you split the people that live in a state that is not the one where they served, can you check if the state belongs to the ethnic homeland, the same ethnic homeland of the ethnic homeland where they served or not? To try
so that's a third
it's really
one
just
here.
about moving or not moving. Sorry?
That's this third row here. So
but does it tell if it's in the same homeland? Like, does it tell if it's an Igbo homeland or not?
So this, when I say non-NYSC region, I'm saying these are people who the state where you served in. So for instance, say you served in an Igbo state, you served in Abia State, so are you then living in another state? And I'm excluding all the other Igbo states so that it's not just that you. Okay.
I thought it was just the one state where you had.
Oh, that's the second row. The second row is just the one state.
Okay.
It's not the state you were posted in, and then the third one I'm looking for that the overall ethnic region that you were posted in. Are you outside that ethnic region as well?
Okay, I see.
Yes. So that's, and I mean the questions are getting smaller, meaning that there's some part of it that is explained by being in the same state and the same region, but it's not all that's going on. And this next table actually, so I found this, and again, whenever I break things down to these 4 levels, I just always remind people that, I have about a little less than 600 observations in general, split across 5 groups. And so now keep that in mind when we're doing this like sub-analysis. So what we find here is that living in, if you served in the Hausa region, so these columns are where you served, and then the rows are the different outcomes. So if you served in the Hausa region, you're more likely to be living in almost every part of the country. And this, this is now speculation, but I think it's interesting that it was the region where it was almost like the harshest conditions, where people were not saying they had the most positive experience, that we do see these same people being more mobile. In that sense of, if you've gone out once and you've seen in some sense the worst that could be, then it really removes this fear of moving outside your own region. That is speculation. But this is just showing what the distribution looks like across where you're living now and where you were posted.
But let me just stop you to say that I think this is very consistent with some of the literature we have, right? So we were talking before the seminar about the work of Brian et al. In Bangladesh, And what we see in the years after the experiment is exactly, okay, you have it there. So
yes. No, that's exactly it. I feel like we're in a world where we're dealing with, so before I get there, second result here was about being more knowledgeable about other regions. So the quiz is on the survey is who's the governor, and I asked them, I give a state in the Hausa region, a state in the Igbo region, a state in the Yoruba region, asking them to tell me the name of the governor of that state and the capital of that state. And so what we find is that people, this is the index of these different responses. They are more knowledgeable of a non-Yoruba region when they have been exposed. So this first row is the impact of exposure on knowledge of a non-Yoruba region. We find that they are able to give answers, correct answers more of the time. And then I do the same thing about if it's a non-Yoruba region and a non-NYC region. So not the one place where you served, but just anywhere else in the country, are you able to give better answers? And I also find yes. And then I also ask about the Yoruba region, and there you find no impact, as we would expect. There are high levels of knowledge of the Yoruba region, that's 0.84 here, but no impact by being exposed elsewhere. So there's a final question I would ask about, if you were offered a job in the same career line in X region of the country with a 10%, 50%, 100% increase in salary, how likely would you be to take it? So here the results are positive but not significant, in that we see a willingness to migrate to non-Yoruba regions at all the different percentage levels of increase in salary, but it's not statistically significant impact on that. But overall, taken together, these results where we see that they're more likely to be living and more knowledgeable, and seeing some marginally significant evidence of the hypothetical answer, I think one way to think about is exactly what Katia was saying about mental barriers to migration. So in the migration literature, there are typical barriers that we think about that restricts efficient allocation of labor, like constraints in credits, insurance, land markets. But here it seems that there could also be mental barriers where when people now have exposure, it would increase their willingness to move in the future. And some quotes that we got from participants were things saying about NYC changed my orientation. Now it's easy to relate to Igbos. I'm not afraid to face them, or it was an eye-opener for me. If you grew up in the South, you feel scared to go to the North, but the exposure helped me. And just people talking about how that one exposure changed their perceptions. And so we thought about, yes.
Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt. Just, I just wanted to make sure that I read your slide right. The slide on with the results about the migration to other regions. The control, if I remember right, the control means are basically 0 for almost all the regions. Was that right?
Yes.
That in the absence of this treatment, no one is living in regions besides Yoruba regions. And so I say it just to highlight that these seem like enormous effects on people's willingness to move, which is just a really interesting and amazing finding.
Yes, so thanks. Overall, countrywide, it's a little less than 5% of these, overall from this cohort, a little less than 5% of them are anywhere else, but they're all mostly concentrated in Abuja. The only thing that gets people to move to other parts that is not in this, the capital, are these, what we're finding here is that it's otherwise close to 0%, except in the presence of this treatment.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And so we could think of this as having, really significant implications for individuals and more broadly for economic growth. So I know that we wanted to leave the last 15 minutes for questions, so I'm going to rush through very quickly to finish. And so
as we go, so take your time. I mean, you have at least 20 minutes, if you wish.
Okay.
Let me ask this question again, Oyebola.
Yes.
How did the posting of this member of NYC, were they posted to the city, the state capital alone, or they were distributed across the state? Because, if you live in the city, for instance, I serve in the north, I serve in Kaduna State. If you live in the city, if you live in the city, it is easier for you to relate to people, to see people from almost all other parts of Nigeria speaking English or speaking English. But if you go to the rural area, you will have problems relating, particularly in some rural parts of the north, you have problems relating, and that may affect your experience. I want to ask you that, how did you manage the people that you recruited for this experiment? Were they posted only to the city because that may influence their experience positively, or were they distributed across the?
Yes, so the people, well, thanks a lot. So these people were recruited not based on where they were posted. Instead, it's everybody that was assigned from one university that we're looking at. So you have a mix. You have people that are posted to the state capital, people that are posted to rural areas. So these results are showing combined results for all of them.
Yeah, I know. But if you have.
So what you're saying is that the results might be different, and it's something that.
If they are predominantly in the city, because when I was in NYSC camp, for instance, the local government that I was posted to, people were praying against the local government from the NYSC camp. So
I see they don't want to go there. That was like the
least. They don't want to go there.
Yeah, so that's one thing I can also do. I have data on which local government were you posted to. And so one could look at that to see, so this same ruralness variable that right now is at the state level, one can look at it at the local government level and then see, okay, by what distinctions do we find whether you're in an urban setting or rural setting, and how that might change some of these impacts. I think that might be very relevant, especially for this section we're about to talk about the relationships with other, or your attitudes towards people going forward. So for instance, the main outcome here, when we're now looking at what is your attachment to the country, your own group and other groups. So migration was the first dimension of integration. Now we're looking at attitudes and relationships towards the country and towards your group and towards other groups. So
that is the more reason why I asked the question, because attitudes towards other people, I mean, people from other ethnic groups and the country as a whole, because if you look at it,
yes,
I want to say that it could be, one has to be cautious, generating policy from this particular study, because if you look at what is going on in the country, and on social media platform, you see people graduate who have been part of this program, and what they say about other ethnic groups within the country, and what is going on generally. It may be difficult to say that, okay, this result is actually the result is fine, and speak to the experiment, but then looking at the whole thing in the country as of now, we are really in a very messy situation.
Thank you. This is a very important thing, and this the NYSC, it's a very, and I don't think I emphasize this as much in the earlier part of the lecture, that it's a very contentious policy in Nigeria. One, it's so expensive, there's so much money being pumped into it, and two, people think that you're sending people all around the country, and is it a waste of their time? Like, what's the whole point of this activity and this? And I mean, there are advocates that will say that, oh no, it's good for integration and all of this. I feel like the results that I'm finding, which we'll get to in a second, are interesting because there isn't this clear-cut like, oh, NYSC is like the best thing ever. I think that I'm always very careful to be very precise about what I'm able to say or not. So I'm not able to talk about the overall impact of the program. So this is not an impact evaluation of the National Youth Service, by no means. There's a very specific question it's answering, and it's that, what's the impact of moving people who are all exposed to a diverse cohort, of moving them to live in a place where they are now immersed in a different ethnic group compared to when they are living within their own ethnic group. So it's using the youth service program, and because it's a very influential program and a very contentious program, many times there's the sense of, oh, this is like overall results about what's the impact of NYS, which it really isn't, because everybody here, again, is participating in youth service. The ideal experiment that I would love to be able to do is to take people who, you know, are not able to participate in NYSC and compare them to the full group of people that are participating, because that's I think will give us a full overall impact of the program. But these concerns are very well noted. And the to move into the impacts on people's attitudes, we find the question I ask is, on a scale of 1 to 7, where 1 means not proud at all and 7 means extremely proud, how proud do you feel to be a Nigerian? And then I ask the same question, how proud do you feel to be a Yoruba? And so proud to be Nigerian, we find that there is an increase overall from people who have been exposed to other parts of the country. At the same time, we find that there's an increase in those who are in their pride of being Yoruba. And then the third question, it asks them, if you had to choose between being a Nigerian or being a Yoruba, which one would you choose? And on that one, we don't find any impact at all. I think it's because we're finding these increases in both the ethnic identity as well as the national identity. And this I feel like is one of the interesting things about this paper, the findings, is that there's a general idea that, oh, if your ethnic identity is going to, your ethnic identity needs to be diminished in order to create a national identity. But in this situation, we're seeing both of them coexisting and growing together. Second set of questions is, how do you feel towards other ethnic groups? So there's an index where we ask about closeness. How close do you feel to Hausas, to Igbos, to Yorubas? And it goes from not close at all to extremely close. How much do you trust them? Again, ask for each of the groups. And then if your close relative was going to marry someone from each of these 3 groups, would you be in favor or opposed to it happening? And then for inter-ethnic relationships, we ask, have you ever dated or been in a serious relationship with anyone? And then we ask them about those different groups. And then also ask, for those that are married, which ethnic group is your spouse? So what do we find? First row, the outcome is attitudes towards Yorubas. And here we don't find any significant impact on these closeness, trust, inter-ethnic marriage, support for inter-ethnic marriage, which again, if you recall, we're here looking at the intensive margin of exposure. So if we think about inter-ethnic, intergroup contact theory, these are not people who've never encountered a Hausa or Yoruba or a Hausa or Igbo before. They're all in this cohort, but now by living among them, we don't find any further updating. Instead, what we find is that they actually have more positive views towards their own ethnic group, which, as I described earlier, I interpret this as being a reinforcement of their own ethnic identity. We do see something on dating. So have you ever dated a non-Yoruba? We see some impact on that. On marriage to non-Yoruba, overall, we don't see the significant impact, but once we delve into the group specific, we start to see something. So again, this is attitudes towards Hausas. It doesn't matter whether you're posted to Hausa or Northern minority, we don't see anything. Towards Igbos, again, looking at specific regions you've posted to, we don't see that. Attitudes towards Yorubas, we see this, the increase there. Dating, have you ever dated a Hausa? We see this among the people that are posted to Hausa states or the Northern minority states, which also has a lot of Hausas. Have you ever dated an Igbo? We see this amongst the Southern minority states. It's positive and, you know, statistically the same among these 2 for Igbos and Southern minorities, which are quite distinct from the results among the Hausa and Northern minority. Quick question, can you see my cursors as I'm moving around? Yes, okay, just to be sure that you can see what variables I'm referring to. And then for marriage to Igbo, we see this among those that are served in an Igbo region here. So there is this interesting dynamic where people are saying, oh, I don't feel like I trust them, or I don't feel like I am closer to them. But then you are seeing these romantic relationships. And the way that I interpret that, and I'm eager to hear other thoughts people might have, is that conditional on your affinity for the group, exposure means that there are more of them around you that you could potentially date or get into a long-term relationship with. So it's, if I feel a certain way about people from, I'm just going to pick a country, Cambodia, but then I am now exposed to more of them, then statistically, the probability of having a relationship might increase in that regard. And we do see that this happens specifically people that are exposed to those regions. So just recapping all the results, what we're finding is that, yes, we are seeing greater geographic integration. People are more mobile across the country. We're seeing increased familiarity with different regions of the country. We're seeing greater national pride. And then we also see this evidence of more romantic relationships. At the same time, we're seeing this reinforcement of your own ethnic identity and the views of your group, and not any updating the attitudes towards other groups. And so I think the main takeaways that I have from this study are as follows. So one is that when we talk about intergroup exposure, the specific type of exposure matters a lot. In this case, we see that there's something about the physical relocation that appears to be expanding people's boundaries and people's sense of the unit and the entity to which they belong to. And so we find that physical relocation has this unique dimension. And two is that in this case, we're also talking about a degree of interethnic exposure. In this case, when you expose people all the way to the point at which they're now literally the minority, this tends to reinforce their own ethnic identity. Second is about the intensive margin of social contact. This appears to promote more opportunity for relationships, even holding constant affinity towards other groups. And lastly is that national pride and ethnic pride are not mutually exclusive. There's the quote from one of the African leaders that's, it says, "For the nation to live, the tribe must die." But here we're seeing actually that both can increase simultaneously. So that's summary. I wanted to lastly just talk about the fact that I think a lot of the richness and interesting things at the next level come from these like region-specific exposure, which I did a little bit here. But again, there's limited sample sizes. And so I don't find systematic differences across these things. Like if you're posted to the same ethnic group and the same different ethnic group, but same religion, I've done those checks where I don't find those results coming out clear and strong. But overall, I think the big picture results is what we're seeing here, where we're having the national pride and the ethnic pride growing simultaneously, and the ethnic pride is coming. My interpretation is that is coming from the fact that these people are now the level of exposure is so much more that now they're actually living as they actually lived as minorities in these other cultures. So 7 years later, we're finding that these impacts persist. I'll go ahead and stop there now.
Thank you so much, Oyebola. This was really super interesting. I don't know if anyone has questions at this point.
I have a question.
Yes, please.
Thank you. I was wondering about, these people that went to different places, non-Yoruba places. So they probably had to endure, worse conditions, right? Because they had to make an additional effort to reach to different people, and they probably grew a little bit more than the other people. So I was wondering whether you could pick up actually effects on economic outcomes. So because you haven't mentioned those, so I was wondering whether you tried and whether you find anything.
Yes.
That's
No.
the first question. Then I have another one.
Oh, you have a second question? Okay, go ahead.
Yeah. The second question is about. This is a mandatory program, so I was wondering about whether you could have a sense about whether people were really against their will doing this or not. Whether you could distinguish those two types of people somehow. You probably a posteriori, it's probably difficult, but yeah, I have to ask, because that sounds interesting to me. So because you could have very different reactions for those two different types of people. So these types of programs, sometimes they are voluntary, right? So yeah, and voluntary programs are okay. I mean, it could be more successful to have a voluntary program than a mandatory program. I don't know. It's a question. So I was wondering whether you could speak to that as well. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Okay, so the first question was about the economic outcomes from going here. And I think that that's something that I was very interested in, because some of the arguments you have is that if you send somebody, for instance, to a rural village somewhere, they're just wasting that 1 year of their life, right? That's, you know, their peers maybe are able to have like a nicer job somewhere and really increasing their human capital. And, you know, these people are really disadvantaged if they are, so that's part of the, I mean, now talking more broadly about the youth service and not specific to the identification angle that I'm able to look at here. And so,
but actually meaning the opposite, right? I was actually meaning that going to a
oh, that's true, because they become like, you know, their grit and determination and like
enriching. So that was my hypothesis. But yes,
I saw it could go either way. Absolutely. The short answer to your question is that we tried, but found quite a lot of difficulty collecting outcomes about like salaries on a phone survey. There was just a lot of hesitation and lack of mistrust, and so we had large numbers of missing variables, of missing responses on that, and so it's not really usable in this outcome. But it was definitely one of the an area of interest. Second question about who is willing, or who went willingly and who didn't. I would say that I don't have a question that specifically asks them, how happy were you to go? And again, obviously, this is now 8 years later. Whatever they tell us about what they were thinking 7 years later, we have to take with a big grain of salt. But I think that they are the people who we know for sure that they were so not willing that they were willing and able to actually change where they ended up being posted to, right? So those are the people that were able to view. And so if we just think of the compliers that we have, so meaning those people who did not redeploy, then in a sense, those are the people that were actually able to study in this setting. We are looking at people whose reluctance to go was not strong enough that they were able or willing to change that. But I do hear you that, and so I don't think that I'm able to specifically answer that broader question of, you know, would this be better off as a voluntary program or not? Simply because I don't have that specific direct evidence. But I would say that whatever evidence that we're able to look at, it does, it is focused on those people who in some sense did comply with being mandatorily assigned to a specific place. And again, there's the people who just simply did not do the program at all. Very few is the sense that I have. I don't see them in the sample, but personally, I know people who just completely refuse to do youth service because they're like, I'm going to the US and I'm never going back. Yeah. But that's a question that I don't have a direct answer to, Pedro, about what would be better, voluntary or mandatory. Yeah.
Maybe I can ask a question also. So
yes, please.
I really like your result on the migration. So I was wondering if you asked people the motive for their migration, because you have these results on, say, inter-ethnic marriage, but it could also be economic migration. I mean, in the sense, the spirit of the paper for Bangladesh. So what do you think is happening here in terms of migration? What are the drivers, and what was the mechanism through which this program might have affected people's migration decisions?
Thanks. So the sense that I have is that it's made people more, it's like an opening up. You know, if you've never traveled outside of your state or your own ethnic region, And like I said, at baseline, 95% of Yorubas are living in theirs. It's just not on your sense of things to do. Like, why would I do that? Nobody does it, around me. But when you've been forced essentially to do it once, then you actually have experience. I think in the Brian et al. Paper, they talk about migration being an experience good. Like, you've experienced it once, and so you're more informed, and it becomes an option to you. It becomes something that you will consider doing. That's what I think is going on. It's that there's this mental barrier that is being broken down, that people are now willing to consider these alternatives and are willing to actually take advantage of them.
And so your feeling is that this is also economic migration. So these are people that decide to go to other regions because they are looking for jobs. That's like the driver.
Yes, I think, I mean, my sense would be, that's what I would think.
Okay.
Because the results we find on like interethnic marriage are not that strong, and they're only limited to one specific ethnic group. So I don't think that could be driving any of these other results. Yeah.
Okay, thank you so much.
Sure.
Okay. Not sure.
Yes, I have a comment, I guess, not more of a question. So, I mean, given that the results that you saw enforce this national identity and also ethnic identity. So, I mean, my thought was thinking about it in terms of, I'm not sure for Nigeria, but in some countries where there's this tribal politics going on, where people vote along tribal lines. So just a thought in terms of what, I don't know whether that is something that is very much relevant for Nigeria, but coming from Gambia, where we're having elections very soon, but in terms of the vibe, you can see that people talk when you have conversation with them about this. But given this experiment where people are kind of forced to live elsewhere, maybe this might change norms. The whole linking it with the general migration literature of changing norms of people. Once you travel, you kind of take things from where you travel.
No, thanks. That's very interesting. So if I understand correctly, you're saying that given this exposure, that it might also affect things politically. So people, instead of instinctively or just as based on their existing norms, voting along ethnic lines, they might actually consider other factors in their choice of who to vote for. I think that'll be interesting. I mean, I don't have outcomes on your voting behavior here. Would have been interesting, but I think that's, I mean, my suspicion, given that question and what do you think about if you had to choose national ethnic where we don't actually find any impact, that maybe there'll be no impact, but I can't say for sure.
So I just have something to add. So you have a nice paper, nice presentation.
Thank you.
One thing that I was kind of concerned about is, I mean, this paper actually, maybe because of limitation of the data set, we just focus on the Yoruba. It would be interesting to also see other, at least the major ethnic groups, to see how do they feel about this, right? So you mentioned earlier in your presentation that Yorubas are kind of more outgoing, right? And they're not so ethnic or tribalistic compared to the others for one reason or other based on history, right?
I don't know. I don't remember saying that.
Okay, sorry. So maybe I
no, I was saying that there was no history of the secession, you know, the war. Like that I think, you know, so if I think is one difference. But I feel that you're exactly right. Like this would be super interesting because if, you know, to look at it from the other, you know, dominant ethnic groups or even some minority groups, like what happens to them if forever they've been living as a minority and now they're moving to a majority group, you know. And so I feel like there's so many dimensions on which that will be interesting.
Yeah, because I mean, you did mention it, right? That because some of the ethnic groups actually did experience the war, so how does that even help them to reintegrate into the nation, right? Being that they have already experienced the war. So, you know, that from the Igbos and also partly from the people in northern minority and also the Hausas. So how did that actually affect them? Because that was actually the reason why the NYC was created, right? So after the war, so at least with that, you're actually answering to the question of the reason of the NYSC to see actually whether there's an effect on that. Now,
Yes.
secondly, I do not know whether you are able to get administrative data on from the NYC itself rather than just going to the university, because at least with that, you're able to get a huge sample.
Exactly.
Now, you might not be able to actually, survey everyone that has done that, but it kind of gives you a sense of what is the impact of the NYC program, even on educational outcomes. So, for instance, you could use things on DHS DHS data to see, okay, being posted to these areas, how does it affect the educational outcomes of those that stay in that area? And how does that really affect the integration in terms of ethnicity, right? Using the Afrobarometer data, for instance. So, these are things that could actually be like a scale up of your paper to actually investigate more things related to do.
No, you're exactly right. I spent many, I don't want to, weeks parading up and down NYC offices in Abuja, trying to get admin data from them and just getting the runaround. And, and so it was after that, because that was the original intention, right? To do this across the country. It was after that that I then had to change strategy and develop, a relationship with one university where they were more open. They understood it was for research. I just did not have progress with the NYC office in the first attempt. And so, and I think, it's also, I was just like a graduate student come in, and I can understand the skepticism and lack of trust and all of that. So it is what it is. And so, but the interesting thing right now is that I'm working with a team, and we're doing exactly what you described in the second thing of trying to look at the people who are served and what is the impact on them. Because the whole thought is that if I am, say, in a school somewhere and I have a youth service member come and they teach physics or they teach something that I'm learning, how does that affect my own educational outcomes? Many times, these schools actually rely on having youth service members come and spend this year there. So we're doing exactly what you suggest about trying to see how the postings are relating to student outcomes in those communities. So thanks.
Good work, Oyebola. I just have this to say about your work again. Going back to my earlier question, maybe in future, if you have the opportunity, how do you see the effect of languages, dominant languages in this area? Because that will really help to integrate the country more. Because those NYC, we used to have a short period of maybe 1 week or two to learn some basic things about the other tribes' languages. So, and if you look at it, that may, really affect the result of the result. If maybe in future, if you have the resources to, see the effect of the language exposure on the participant of the NYC program.
And so just to clarify, language exposure, like teaching them the dominant language of where they're going to serve?
No. The NYC member, if you are coming from the Southwest now, you are a Yoruba person, you are a Yoruba man, going to Hausa Muslim North. If you have knowledge of the language used in that area, Hausa language, for instance, or Igbo language in the East, that may affect experience in the environment. Totalize experience post NYC.
I see.
If you have the resources later, you may be able to, you may just want to see what happens if something like this happens.
Great.
Yes.
Thanks for that.
Yeah. I don't know if you want to, I think we are, running over time. This was really interesting. I thank you so much for your availability for everyone's questions. And well, we hope to be able to host you in person very soon. For now, thank you for your availability. You'll keep talking to all of us. So thank you again. And thank you everyone for a great seminar. Thanks, bye.
Yeah, thank you again for the invitation. This was fun.
Our pleasure.
I look forward to coming in person.
Yes.
Yeah.
Thanks everyone.
Yeah, bye.
Bye.